This is the story of Crosstown Alliance, from a ripple to a wave. We call it Ripples of Grace because back in 2012, we heard about a church that was 35 miles away that was struggling to survive. The church had gone through a church split from 40 people down to about 20, and when we approached them, there were about 10 people remaining, all of which probably served on their board. Their pastor was bivocational, and they really didn't have a future going forward. The writing was on the wall, and their church was going to close unless we did something about it. I remember during that time teaching our church, which was at that time around 180 people, through the story of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah hears about something that happened over 1,000 miles away, and his heart breaks. He has this holy discontent to do something about the walls of Jerusalem, which had been burnt and torn down. And so he acts and he steps up and he moves. And so that was the challenge for our church, to do something about the dilemma, the problem that we saw all over our region of churches struggling to survive and eventually closing their doors. And we couldn't solve everybody's problem, but we wanted to be a part of the solution for this church. And so we approached their board and kind of cast this vision for a new church, to be one church in two locations, to do this thing together, to share this sermon and to deliver it via video, but to have a campus pastor at each location that focused on discipleship and leadership development and equipping of the saints, as Paul refers to in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. Just to pool our resources together, all of our resources that we had and their limited resources. It seemed like a win-win. But unfortunately, their board decided to close their church doors. And they had their last service in the fall of 2012. But that wasn't the end of the story. After many months of prayer and discussion by the leaders of this church, the elders, staff, and governing board, we feel led to put Acts 1:8 in a very real way into our church. And that is to start a multi-site campus in Olean, New York, at the Grace Alliance Church. Our district gave us ownership of that building, and over the next year we renovated and we revitalized that struggling church, and we sent 30 launch team members from a church of only 180 people. And to say that there was some anxiety in those early days whether or not this was going to work is an understatement. We had no clue whether this was going to be successful. In fact, our campus pastor in Olean, Pastor Andy, thought perhaps maybe only 30 people would show up to the first service. Little did we know that God would send over 120 people to launch that church. And God has been faithful from the very beginning of those early days. I remember one of the remnants from the old church, which just so happened to be called the Grace Alliance Church. Her name was Cheryl, and she decided to be a part of this adventure with that launch team for our very first campus plant. I found out a couple years after that she likes to jump out of airplanes. Her hobby is skydiving. And I thought that suited her and the church well, that we believe that playing it safe is risky. There's a lot at stake when we consider the future of the church. And if we're going to accomplish what Jesus wants to accomplish, then we need to take faith-filled risks. And so that's been our story. We've been able to replicate this model 3 times over. 2 years later, after our first campus plant, we heard about a church in Arcade, New York, with only 12 people remaining. Sweet people who loved Jesus but didn't really have a future because their pastor was retiring and they wouldn't be able to afford another pastor. And so we approached their church with this same model, to do church together, not just 2 churches working together, but now 3 churches. Here's the vision. Start a multi-site church campus in Arcade, New York next Easter. And over the next 9 months, we renovated that building as well to revitalize a struggling church together. I remember in those early days of that campus, there was only 3 children. 3 children out of those 15 remaining members. And on Easter Sunday 2015, that church launched with 237 people in attendance. Now, there wasn't 3 children, there was a whole slew of children all over the place in that Kids Zone area. It was a fun, creative environment where kids could learn about Jesus on their level. In fact, one of my favorite spots at the arcade campus is where the kids check in and actually go down to their kids' own classrooms through a swirly slide. It's neat to see fresh life being breathed into these dying churches. And 2 years later, we were able to add a third location.
God has given us the exciting opportunity to open up our fourth campus in none other than Shingle House, Pennsylvania.
Shingle House has a population of 1,100 people, and it's a reminder to us that God cares even for those small town churches, and He wants to do a significant work in those rural churches. And so we were able to send a campus pastor along with a launch team, all of which came from our own existing campuses. Our campus pastor was our worship leader and youth pastor at one of the locations, and he was driving 30 minutes to our church to help minister. Now we were able to send him back into his own community with people that were, geographically speaking, closer to that new campus. And I remember that very first workday.
We are at our first workday here on Saturday, October 7th, 2017.
There was no better illustration of a church being better together than 60 people showing up with all kinds of background and gifting and experiences and skill sets in construction to help a dying church. 60 people from 3 other churches, some of which had to drive 1 hour and 10 minutes just to help. We just believe that we're better together. It's a part of our DNA, it's a part of our culture, whereas we kind of stumbled upon this whole multi-site thing, not to be cool, not because it was the latest trend, but because we saw a need in another community, and we did not want to see the light of the gospel extinguished in those churches. And now we're just more intentional about it. We've hired a campus plant pastor to plant a 5th location, which we've identified.
This is kind of where it all started, and then we're moving. And you know, we've expanded out. We've gone to Olean over there, Arcade up there, Shingle House down in Pennsylvania. You know, it's funny, if you zoom out a little bit, a guy from Shingle House last week as I was visiting there, he had his iPad out and he was trying to guess where we were going next. So he pulled up all the Christian and Missionary Alliance churches kind of in the region, and you know, he zoomed out and he saw the locations, and he was like, I bet you it's there, I bet you it's there. The problem was, here's the problem, his vision wasn't big enough. He didn't zoom out far enough. If you keep going, this is where the Lord is leading us next, all the way to, believe it or not, Rochester.
Which has a population of not 1,100, but 177,000 in a 5-mile radius. And so God has used that model to convince us that we're better together. We're not just better together, but we're stronger together, and that we need to stay together as a church to solve this problem that we see all around the country. In our region alone, in our district, there's 78 churches. 20 years ago, there was 95 churches. Think about that. In 20 years, there's been close to 20 church closures. And out of those 78 churches left, 30 are actually hanging on by a thread that we've identified that perhaps could close within the next 3 to 5 years. We're not okay with that. And again, we can't solve everybody's problem, but we want to be a part of the solution. We feel like this model is one of the models that the Lord is blessing. And so, as you attempt to lead change in your context, may you be inspired as we have been over the last several years, as we've seen God move in our midst, a God that is able to do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine. May you too be inspired that one small ripple can create a wave of change.